I never imagined I'd become the landlord who evicted her own son, but sometimes blood doesn't excuse bad behavior. The woman who raised a family, built a business, and treated everyone with dignity found herself being told she was too old for a full dinner plate. Well, let me tell you how quickly respect can be restored when you hold the deed to someone's home and aren't afraid to use it. There's something particularly cutting about being diminished by someone you welcomed into your family with open arms. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Patricia Williams, though most folks call me Pat. And at 68, I've lived long enough to know that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all. It's enabling. My silver hair might frame a face that's earned every line through years of hard work, but my mind is sharp as the day I started my nursing career 45 years ago. After my husband Tom passed from a sudden heart attack 12 years ago, I could have shrunk into grief and dependency. Instead, I channeled that pain into purpose, transforming the small inheritance he left into what became Williams Property Management, a portfolio of 8 rental properties scattered throughout Riverside, California. The Victorian house on Magnolia Street, where I've lived for 30 years, sits like a queen among the neighborhood's more modest homes. Its wraparound porch and original hardwood floors telling stories of Sunday dinners, birthday parties, and the countless memories Tom and I created while raising our 2 children. Sarah, my older daughter, inherited her father's steady temperament and practical wisdom, channeling both into her role as principal at Riverside High School. She married David Martinez, a gentle soul who works as an electrician, and together, they've raised Emma and Jake, grandchildren who still light up when they see me coming with homemade cookies or tickets to the latest animated movie. Then there's Michael, my son, the child who always needed just a little more guidance, a little more patience, a little more help finding his way. At 42, he's a good man with a generous heart, working as an insurance adjuster for a regional firm, but he's never quite mastered the art of standing firm when it matters most. Perhaps that's why he fell so completely under the spell of Jessica Stevens, a whirlwind of opinions and energy who swept into our family 3 years ago like a Category 3 hurricane disguised as a spring breeze. I remember the first time Michael brought Jessica to Sunday dinner, how she complimented my pot roast and asked thoughtful questions about the antique serving pieces that had belonged to my grandmother. She was attractive in that polished way some women perfect, with highlighted blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, and a wardrobe that suggested someone who understood the power of first impressions. Her job managing a Target store might not have been glamorous, but she spoke about her responsibilities with the confidence of someone running a Fortune 500 company. "Mrs. Williams," she said, helping me clear the dinner dishes despite my protests, "Michael talks about you constantly. He's so proud of what you've accomplished since Mr. Williams passed. Building a business from nothing, maintaining all these beautiful properties. It's really inspiring." The words were perfectly chosen, the tone respectful and warm, and I found myself genuinely charmed by this woman who seemed to appreciate both my son and the life I'd worked so hard to build. Sarah, ever the cautious observer, pulled me aside as Jessica and Michael stepped onto the back patio to admire my rose garden. "She seems nice enough," my daughter said, but something in her voice suggested reservation. Very polished, very intentional about everything she says. I dismissed Sarah's subtle warning as perhaps a touch of protective instinct. She'd always been slightly suspicious of people who presented themselves too perfectly, a trait that served her well as a school administrator, but sometimes made her overly critical in social situations. When Michael and Jessica announced their engagement 8 months later, I was genuinely happy for them. She'd been a constant presence at family gatherings, always arriving with a hostess gift, always offering to help with preparation or cleanup, always saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. The wedding was lovely, held at St. Mary's Church with a reception at the Riverside Community Center, and I danced with my new daughter-in-law, welcoming her officially into our family with hopes that she would bring Michael the stability and partnership he'd always seemed to seek. The first year of their marriage appeared to validate my optimism. They rented a small apartment across town, and Jessica seemed to be encouraging Michael's ambitions, talking about their plans to save for a house, to maybe start a family, to build the kind of life Tom and I had created together. She was attentive during family gatherings, remembering everyone's preferences, asking follow-up questions about work or school or health concerns from previous conversations. If there were small moments that gave me pause, the way she sometimes corrected Michael's stories or spoke for him when someone asked his opinion, I attributed them to the normal adjustments of early marriage. The trouble began, as these things often do, with what seemed like a reasonable request. Michael called me on a Tuesday evening in March, his voice carrying that particular note of embarrassment that had characterized his requests for help since childhood. Mom, I hate to ask, but we're having some financial difficulties. The apartment rent went up significantly, and with my hours being cut back at the insurance company, we're struggling to make ends meet. Jessica suggested I talk to you about maybe renting one of your properties at a family rate, just until we get back on our feet. The request wasn't unreasonable. The craftsman-style house on Oak Avenue had been vacant for 2 months after my previous tenants moved to Phoenix, and the mortgage was easily manageable, even with reduced rental income. More importantly, helping family navigate temporary difficulties seemed like the right thing to do, the kind of support Tom would have offered without hesitation. Of course, I told Michael, we can work out something fair for everyone. What? I quoted them was roughly 60% of market rate, a significant discount that would save them nearly $800 monthly while still covering my basic expenses on the property. Jessica's response, delivered through Michael since she apparently felt it inappropriate to negotiate directly with me, was that they'd been hoping for something closer to 50% of market rate, given that this was a family arrangement, and they'd be providing the kind of reliable, long-term tenancy that would save me the hassle and expense of advertising and showing the property. I agreed to the lower rate, partly because the logic seemed sound, and partly because I wanted to start this new phase of our relationship on a positive note. We drew up a simple lease agreement, nothing too formal since we were family, and Michael and Jessica moved into the Oak Avenue house on a sunny Saturday in April, with David and me helping load and unload the rental truck, while Sarah provided sandwiches and lemonade for the volunteers. The house suited them beautifully. Built in 1925, it featured the kind of architectural details that gave a home character. Built-in bookcases, original hardwood floors, a kitchen with vintage tile counters that Jessica immediately declared absolutely charming. The backyard was spacious enough for entertaining, with mature fruit trees and a vegetable garden plot that the previous tenants had maintained. Standing in the living room as Michael and Jessica arranged their furniture, watching them discuss where to hang wedding photos and which corner would be perfect for a Christmas tree, I felt genuinely satisfied with my decision to help them establish their first real home together. The changes began so subtly that I almost missed them entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica, who had always been effusive in her gratitude and praise, became more reserved during family gatherings. She still attended every Sunday dinner, still brought hostess gifts, and offered to help with cleanup, but there was a new quality to her interactions that felt less warm, more performative. When I complimented a new hairstyle or outfit, her thank you felt automatic rather than genuine. When I asked about her work or their life in the new house, her responses became increasingly brief and generic. More concerning were the small comments that seemed designed to highlight my age and supposed limitations. "Pat, let me get that heavy serving dish for you," she'd say, reaching for something I'd been carrying perfectly well for decades. "You shouldn't be lifting anything that could strain your back at your age." The words were framed as concern, but the tone carried an unmistakable suggestion that I was becoming frail. that my capabilities were diminishing in ways I apparently couldn't recognize myself. At first, Michael seemed oblivious to these subtle shifts, or perhaps he was choosing not to notice them. But during one Sunday dinner in June, when Jessica interrupted my story about a difficult tenant situation to suggest that perhaps I should consider hiring a property management company to handle such stressful responsibilities, I saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe, or discomfort with his wife's increasingly patronizing attitude toward his mother. "Mom's been managing properties successfully for over a decade," he said quietly, not quite meeting Jessica's eyes. "I think she knows what she's doing." It was a mild defense, but it was something, and I felt a flutter of hope that perhaps Michael was beginning to see what Sarah and I had both noticed, that Jessica's solicitousness was beginning to feel more like condescension than genuine care. Jessica's smile never wavered, but her voice carried a sharp edge when she replied, "Of course she does, honey. I'm just thinking about her well-being. At 68, she shouldn't have to deal with tenant problems and maintenance headaches. She's earned the right to relax and enjoy her golden years." The phrase golden years was delivered with particular emphasis, as if she were gently but firmly reminding everyone present that I had crossed some invisible threshold into old age and diminished capacity. The property management suggestion became a recurring theme over the following months. Every time I mentioned a repair issue or a tenant concern, Jessica would nod sympathetically and return to her conviction that I was taking on too much responsibility for someone my age. She began researching local property management companies, presenting me with brochures and business cards she'd collected, explaining the benefits of letting professionals handle the day-to-day stresses while I enjoyed the passive income from my investments. "You've worked so hard for so many years," she'd say, her tone treading the fine line between respectful and patronizing. "Don't you think it's time to let someone else take care of the details?" The implication was always the same, that my age had made me less capable, less sharp, less able to handle responsibilities I'd been managing successfully for years. What made it particularly galling was that these suggestions came from someone whose own professional experience consisted of managing a retail store staff of 12 people. The dinner portion comments began in August. Jessica had always been health conscious, the type of person who ordered salads at restaurants and talked knowledgeably about superfoods and antioxidants. But her observations about my eating habits took on an increasingly critical tone that she disguised as concern for my health and well-being. "Pat, that's quite a large portion," she'd observe as I served myself what had always been my normal helping of pot roast or casserole. "Are you sure you need that much food at your age? Your metabolism isn't what it used to be." The first time she made such a comment, I was so startled that I didn't respond at all. The second time, I managed a weak laugh and a comment about having worked up an appetite during my morning walk. But as the observations became more frequent and more pointed, I began to feel self-conscious about every bite I took in Jessica's presence, hyper-aware of her disapproving gaze whenever I reached for seconds or accepted a dinner roll. "Maybe smaller portions would be better for your digestion," she'd suggest. Or, "At our age, we really need to watch our calorie intake more carefully." The fact that she was 30 years younger than me made the "our age" particularly insulting. But the comments were always delivered with such apparent concern that calling them out seemed petty or oversensitive. Sarah noticed the change in family dinner dynamics before I was willing to acknowledge it myself. "Mom, have you lost weight?" she asked one evening as we cleaned up together while Jessica and the men watched television in the living room. "You seem to be eating less than usual." When I explained Jessica's health concerns and portion suggestions, Sarah's expression darkened with an anger I rarely saw from my diplomatic daughter. "She's making you feel bad about eating normal portions of food in your own home," Sarah said flatly. "That's not concern, Mom. That's control." But even as I recognized the truth in Sarah's observation, I found myself making excuses for Jessica's behavior, telling myself that she meant well, that perhaps her comments came from a place of genuine care rather than a desire to diminish my autonomy and confidence. The situation escalated significantly during Emma's 13th birthday party in September. I'd offered to host the celebration at my house, as I had for all my grandchildren's major milestones, planning a menu of Emma's favorite foods and decorating the dining room with streamers and balloons in her chosen color scheme of purple and silver. Jessica arrived early to help with preparation, but instead of assistance, she provided a steady stream of criticism disguised as helpful suggestions. "Don't you think this cake is a bit large for the number of people we're having?" she asked, examining the 3-layer chocolate creation I'd spent the morning preparing. "Kids don't eat as much as they used to, and too much sugar isn't good for them anyway." She proceeded to cut portions that were roughly half the size I would normally serve, explaining to anyone who would listen that smaller portions were healthier and that children needed to learn moderation from an early age. When it came time for the adults to eat, Jessica took it upon herself to serve everyone's plates, doling out what she considered appropriate portions based on each person's age, gender, and perceived dietary needs. My plate received noticeably less food than anyone else's, despite the fact that I had cooked the entire meal and was hosting the celebration in my own home. "Perfect portion for you, Pat," she announced cheerfully, setting the half-filled plate in front of me. "Just enough to satisfy without overdoing it. At your age, your body really can't process large meals the way it used to." The comment was made in front of my entire family, including my grandchildren, effectively announcing to everyone present that I was too old to be trusted with making my own dietary choices. David, who rarely spoke up during family discussions, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Maybe Pat can decide for herself how much food she wants," he suggested mildly, but Jessica was already moving on to serve the next person, dismissing his comment with a wave of her hand and a laugh about men never understanding nutritional needs. I sat staring at my inadequate portion, while everyone else enjoyed generous helpings of the meal I had prepared in my own home, feeling humiliated and diminished in a way that went far beyond simple embarrassment. This wasn't just about food, it was about respect, autonomy, and the fundamental right to make my own choices in my own space. But confronting Jessica directly would create drama at Emma's birthday party, so I remained silent, pushing the small portion around my plate while my granddaughter opened presents and my family celebrated around me. After everyone left that evening, I found myself standing in my kitchen, looking at the leftover food Jessica had declared excessive, and finally admitting what Sarah had been trying to tell me for months. This wasn't about health or concern, or age-appropriate behavior. This was about power, control, and a systematic effort to make me feel incapable and dependent. Jessica was treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted to make basic decisions about my own life, and she was doing it with such apparent kindness that calling her out seemed churlish and ungrateful. The realization was both liberating and infuriating. For months, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if perhaps my age really was catching up with me in ways I couldn't see, if maybe I did need more guidance and assistance from younger, more capable family members. But standing alone in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my competence, the successful dinner party I'd planned and executed, the well-maintained home I'd managed for 3 decades, the thriving business I'd built from nothing, I finally understood that the problem wasn't my diminished capacity. The problem was Jessica's need to create that narrative, to position herself as the capable, responsible adult managing an aging parent figure who could no longer be entirely trusted with her own affairs. The next morning, I called Bob Chen, my property management assistant, and asked him to pull the lease agreement for the Oak Avenue property. "Is there a problem with the Williams rental?" he asked, his voice concerned. Bob had been helping me manage paperwork and maintenance issues for 3 years, and he knew that family properties usually required extra delicate handling. "Not exactly a problem," I replied carefully. "I just want to review the terms and make sure everything is properly documented." What I didn't tell Bob was that I was beginning to realize that my casual, family-friendly approach to the lease might have been a mistake. In trying to be generous and trusting, I might have created a situation where Jessica felt entitled to treat me with increasing disrespect because she knew I wouldn't enforce consequences for fear of damaging family relationships. As I reviewed the lease that afternoon, I noticed several things that hadn't seemed important when we'd originally signed the agreement. The lease was month to month rather than a fixed term, which meant either party could terminate with 30 days' notice. There were clauses about property maintenance and tenant responsibilities that Jessica and Michael might or might not be following. I'd been so hands-off in my approach that I honestly didn't know whether they were keeping up with yard work, handling minor repairs appropriately, or maintaining the property's condition as required. Most significantly, I realized that I'd been so focused on being a generous family member that I'd failed to be a responsible landlord. I had no recent photos of the property's condition, no documentation of any improvements or changes they might have made, no record of whether they were complying with the terms they'd agreed to when they moved in. My business-like approach to my other properties had been replaced by a trusting, informal arrangement that left me with very little leverage if problems arose. That evening, I drove slowly past the Oak Avenue house, something I hadn't done in months. What I saw surprised and concerned me. The front yard, which had been neatly maintained when they moved in, was showing signs of neglect. The grass needed cutting, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and several newspapers were scattered across the driveway as if they'd been accumulating for days. One of the upstairs windows had a crack that definitely hadn't been there before, and the garage door was hanging slightly crooked, suggesting some kind of impact or mechanical failure. These weren't catastrophic problems, but they represented a pattern of casual maintenance that suggested Jessica and Michael weren't treating the property with the care and respect it deserved. More troubling was the realization that if this had been any other rental property in my portfolio, I would have addressed these issues immediately with a formal notice and inspection. My desire to avoid seeming intrusive or controlling with family members had allowed standards to slip in ways that could ultimately damage both the property value and our relationship. I spent that night making lists and checking records, approaching the situation with the same methodical precision I brought to all my business decisions. Jessica's disrespectful behavior was one issue, but it was connected to a larger problem. The informal, boundaries-free arrangement we'd created was enabling her to treat both me and my property with increasing casualness. If I wanted the respect I deserved, I needed to start acting like the competent property owner I was, rather than the grateful family member I'd been trying to be. The final straw came 3 weeks later, at what should have been a lovely family dinner celebrating David's promotion to lead electrician at his company. I'd prepared a special meal: herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, wild rice pilaf, and David's favorite lemon meringue pie for dessert. The dining room was set with my good china and the silver candlesticks that had been wedding gifts 45 years earlier. It was the kind of celebration meal that had marked important family milestones for decades, and I was genuinely excited to honor David's achievement and bring everyone together for an evening of good food and conversation. Jessica arrived with Michael carrying a large covered dish that she announced was a healthy alternative to what she was sure would be my traditionally heavy menu. Without asking permission or discussing the addition, she set the dish, some kind of quinoa salad with vegetables, prominently in the center of my carefully arranged table, and began rearranging my serving pieces to accommodate her contribution. "I know how you like to cook, Pat," she said, her tone managing to be simultaneously affectionate and patronizing. "But I thought it would be good to have something light and nutritious available. David's been trying to eat healthier since his promotion, and at our age, we all need to be more conscious of what we're putting in our bodies." The fact that David was 2 years younger than her son, and certainly capable of making his own dietary choices, seemed lost on Jessica, as did the presumption involved in bringing uninvited food to someone else's dinner party. When it came time to eat, Jessica once again took charge of serving, apparently having decided that portion control was now her permanent responsibility at family gatherings. But this time, Her commentary was more pointed and public than it had ever been before. "Just a small piece of salmon for you, Pat," she announced, cutting a portion roughly the size of a child's serving. "And maybe skip the rice. All those carbohydrates aren't good for anyone, but especially not for someone your age who isn't as active as she used to be." The implication that I wasn't active stung particularly sharply, given that I walked 3 miles every morning, maintained a large garden, and regularly climbed ladders to inspect property maintenance issues. But what followed was even worse. When I reached for a dinner roll, Jessica actually moved the basket away from me with a gentle laugh. Now, Pat. We've talked about this. Bread is just empty calories, and at 68, your body really can't process that kind of food efficiently anymore. You'll feel so much better if you stick to smaller, lighter portions." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. David stared at Jessica with undisguised shock. Even Michael looked uncomfortable, though he said nothing to defend me. My grandchildren sat frozen, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. And I sat there, in my own dining room, having been publicly scolded like a child who couldn't be trusted to make appropriate food choices at a celebration dinner I had planned, prepared, and hosted in my own home. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "I think I'm capable of deciding what and how much to eat in my own house." I reached deliberately for the dinner roll basket, taking not 1 but 2 rolls and placing them prominently on my plate. "I've been managing my own nutrition successfully for 68 years, and I don't recall asking for assistance with that responsibility." Jessica's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment. Surprise and something else. Anger, perhaps, or calculation, flashing across her features before the concerned smile returned. "Of course you have, Pat. I didn't mean to overstep. I'm just worried about your health, that's all. We all want you to stay strong and independent for as many years as possible." The words were perfectly chosen to make me seem unreasonable for objecting to her care, but I was done being manipulated by her expert deployment of fake concern. "My health is excellent," I replied evenly, as my doctor confirmed at my physical last month. "And my independence isn't threatened by eating dinner rolls, but it is threatened by being treated like a child who can't make her own decisions." The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable near silence, with everyone carefully avoiding further discussion of food, health, or age-related capabilities. But the damage was done. Jessica had publicly established her position as the responsible adult, managing an increasingly incapable elderly person, and she'd done it so skillfully that any further objection from me would seem defensive and ungrateful. When they left that evening, Michael mumbled an awkward apology for the tension, but he didn't address his wife's behavior directly, and he certainly didn't promise it wouldn't happen again. Standing in my kitchen after everyone had gone, looking at the barely touched quinoa salad that Jessica had insisted was necessary for our health, I finally understood that this situation had moved far beyond family dynamics and dinner table etiquette. This was about fundamental respect, about the right to be treated as a competent adult in my own home, and about whether I was going to allow someone to systematically undermine my dignity and autonomy simply because she'd married into my family. The next morning, I called Linda Thompson, the attorney who'd helped me structure my real estate investments and draft lease agreements for my rental properties. "Linda," I said, "I need to discuss a tenant situation that's become complicated by family relationships. Do you have time to meet this week?" What I didn't tell Jessica and Michael was that their month-to-month lease was about to become much more formal, and their assumption that family relationships would protect them from landlord expectations was about to be thoroughly tested. I'd spent months being made to feel old, incapable, and dependent. Now it was time to remind everyone exactly how capable, independent, and powerful this 68-year-old woman actually was. Linda Thompson's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building downtown, its high ceilings and original, crown molding creating an atmosphere of established authority that immediately put me at ease. Linda herself was a woman in her early 50s who had built her practice specializing in real estate law and family business disputes. Exactly the combination of expertise I needed for my increasingly complex situation. "Tell me about the tenant relationship," Linda said, settling behind her mahogany desk with a legal pad and pen at the ready. "What specific issues are you facing with the property?" I appreciated her direct approach, the way she focused immediately on the legal and business aspects, rather than getting caught up in the family drama that made this situation so emotionally charged. I explained the lease arrangement, the below-market rent I'd agreed to, and the informal nature of our agreement that had seemed appropriate for family, but was now leaving me without clear recourse for addressing problems. "The immediate issue is property maintenance," I said, pulling out the photographs I'd taken during my drive-by inspection. "The exterior condition has deteriorated significantly since they moved in, and I have no recent documentation of the interior condition." Linda examined the photos carefully, making notes about the overgrown landscaping, the cracked window, and the damaged garage door. "These are clear lease violations if your agreement includes standard maintenance clauses," she observed. "Have you documented any communication with the tenants about these issues?" When I admitted that I hadn't addressed the maintenance problems directly, Linda nodded knowingly. "Family relationships complicate landlord responsibilities, but they don't eliminate them. You have both legal rights and legal obligations regardless of your personal connection to the tenants." What followed was an education in landlord-tenant law that made me realize how much I'd compromised my own position by treating this arrangement differently from my other rental properties. "Your month-to-month lease actually gives you significant flexibility," Linda explained. "But it also requires you to follow proper legal procedures for any changes to the tenancy. If you want to modify the rent, change the lease terms, or terminate the tenancy, you need to provide appropriate notice and documentation." The conversation shifted when I described Jessica's increasingly disrespectful behavior and her systematic efforts to portray me as incapable of managing my own affairs. Linda set down her pen and studied my face carefully. "Patricia, what you're describing sounds like a pattern of elder abuse, specifically psychological abuse designed to undermine your confidence and autonomy. While that's not directly a landlord-tenant issue, it certainly affects how you might want to handle this property situation." The term elder abuse hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of Jessica's behavior as rudeness, disrespect, maybe even manipulation. But hearing it labeled as abuse by a legal professional gave me a new framework for understanding what had been happening. "She's never threatened me physically," I said, feeling the need to clarify. "It's more subtle than that. Comments about my age, suggestions that I'm not capable of making good decisions, treating me like a child who needs supervision." "Psychological elder abuse often starts exactly that way," Linda replied matter-of-factly. "Undermining decision-making capacity, creating dependency, using age as a weapon to diminish autonomy. The fact that it's coming from a family member, who also happens to be your tenant in a below-market rental, creates multiple layers of power dynamics that she may be exploiting." Linda's professional assessment gave weight to concerns I'd been hesitant to voice even to myself. We spent the next hour developing a comprehensive strategy that would address both the property issues and the personal dynamics. "First, we formalize everything," Linda explained. "New lease with standard terms, market rate rent, proper maintenance, requirements and clear consequences for violations. Second, we conduct a thorough property inspection with professional documentation. Third, we establish proper boundaries around your personal relationship that don't allow tenant issues to bleed into family dynamics." The plan was more aggressive than I'd initially envisioned, but Linda's reasoning was sound. "Informal arrangements invite informal behavior," she said. "If you want to be treated with respect as a property owner, you need to act like a property owner rather than a family member doing favors. The two relationships don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they need clear boundaries. I left Linda's office with a folder full of legal forms and a timeline for implementing changes that would fundamentally alter my relationship with Michael and Jessica. The new lease would reflect market rates, which meant their rent would increase by nearly $400 monthly. The inspection would document any damage or maintenance issues that needed immediate attention. Most importantly, the formal structure would eliminate Jessica's ability to treat me as a pushover family member who could be manipulated with fake concern and ageist assumptions. The drive home gave me time to consider the implications of what I was about to do. Michael would be shocked by the sudden shift from casual family arrangement to formal business relationship. Jessica would likely be furious at losing her position of assumed authority over both the property and me. There might be accusations of unfairness, exploitation, or using financial leverage to punish family members who'd simply been trying to help an aging relative. But Linda's words echoed in my mind. Respect isn't automatic, even within families, and boundaries aren't cruel. They're necessary for healthy relationships. That evening, I called Bob Chen and asked him to schedule a professional property inspection for the Oak Avenue house. Full documentation, I specified. Interior and exterior condition, maintenance issues, any tenant modifications or damage. I want everything photographed and cataloged as if this were a new rental property. Bob's voice carried a note of curiosity about the unusual request for an existing tenant, but he agreed to arrange the inspection for the following week. The next step was more emotionally challenging. I needed to inform Michael and Jessica about the upcoming changes without giving them time to prepare objections or manipulation tactics. I decided on a straightforward approach, a certified letter outlining the new lease terms, the inspection schedule, and the timeline for implementation. The formal tone would signal that this was a business decision rather than a family discussion open to negotiation or emotional appeals. Drafting that letter required multiple attempts to strike the right balance between professional necessity and family sensitivity. Dear Michael and Jessica, I wrote, as your landlord, I am implementing updated lease terms and property management procedures for all Williams Property Management rentals, including the Oak Avenue property. Please review the enclosed lease agreement, which reflects current market rates and standard maintenance requirements. A property inspection has been scheduled for Thursday, November 15th at 10 a.m. to document current conditions and identify any maintenance issues requiring attention. The letter went on to explain that the new lease would take effect January 1st, giving them 6 weeks to decide whether to accept the new terms or provide notice of their intent to vacate. I included comparable rental rates from similar properties in the neighborhood to demonstrate that the new rent was fair market value rather than punitive pricing. Most importantly, I made clear that this was a business decision applied consistently across my property portfolio, not a personal attack on their family status. Bob delivered the letter on a Wednesday afternoon, timing the delivery for when both Michael and Jessica would likely be home from work. I spent that evening working in my garden, channeling nervous energy into fall cleanup tasks while waiting for the inevitable phone call. It came at 8:23 p.m., Michael's number flashing on my caller ID with an urgency that suggested he'd been trying to process this unexpected development for several hours. Mom, what's going on? Michael's voice carried confusion, hurt, and underlying panic. We got this letter about new lease terms and rent increases. I don't understand why you're suddenly treating us like regular tenants when we're family. The pain in his voice tugged at my maternal instincts, but I'd prepared for this emotional response and steeled myself against being manipulated by his distress. You are regular tenants, Michael, I replied calmly. You're also family, but those are separate relationships with separate responsibilities. As tenants, you're responsible for maintaining the property and paying fair market rent. As family, you're welcome at Sunday dinner and Christmas morning. But I can't continue mixing those roles because it's created problems for everyone involved. There was a long pause before Michael spoke again, his voice smaller and more uncertain. Jessica said you've been acting strange lately, making comments. about our house maintenance and watching what we eat. She thinks maybe you're having some kind of cognitive issues, that we should be worried about you living alone and managing all these properties. The words hit exactly as Jessica had intended them to, turning my reasonable business decisions into evidence of mental decline that justified their concern and intervention. My cognitive function is excellent, I said firmly, as anyone who's worked with me professionally can attest. What's changed is my willingness to let family relationships excuse tenant responsibilities. The property maintenance issues are documented with photographs. The new lease terms are consistent with market rates and standard across my portfolio. These are business decisions made by a competent property owner, not symptoms of mental decline. Michael seemed to be processing this information, perhaps comparing Jessica's narrative about my declining capabilities with the clear, rational explanation I was providing. But Mom, the rent increase is huge. We can't afford another $400 a month on top of everything else. You know I've had my hours cut, and Jessica's not making as much at the store as she hoped. We were counting on the family discount to help us get back on our feet. The financial pressure was real, and I felt genuine sympathy for their situation. But I also recognized the pattern that Linda had helped me identify, the assumption that my resources were available to solve their problems, regardless of how they treated me in return. I understand money is tight, I said gently, but below-market rent is a gift, not an entitlement, and gifts can be withdrawn when the relationship becomes unhealthy. What do you mean unhealthy? Michael's voice sharpened with defensiveness. We've been nothing but respectful and grateful for your help. Jessica's constantly worried about your well-being, trying to make sure you're eating right and not overexerting yourself with property management. If anything, we've been too considerate of your limitations, not acknowledging them enough. There it was, Jessica's narrative fully internalized and reflected back to me by my own son. I was the one with limitations that needed acknowledgement and management. They were the considerate ones making allowances for my declining capabilities. The systematic disrespect had been reframed as loving concern, and my objections were evidence of the very cognitive issues that justified their intervention in the first place. Michael, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, I want you to think carefully about what you just said. You suggested that I have limitations that you and Jessica need to acknowledge and manage. What specific limitations are you referring to? What evidence do you have that my judgment or capabilities have declined in any measurable way? The question clearly caught him off guard. Well, you're 68. At that age, it's natural to start slowing down, needing more help with things. Jessica's just trying to be proactive about making sure you stay safe and healthy. The response was telling, not specific examples of declining function, but vague assumptions about age-related limitations that had been accepted without evidence. I walk 3 miles every morning, I replied matter-of-factly. I maintain 8 rental properties, including handling tenant relations, maintenance coordination, and financial management. I cook elaborate family dinners, host holiday celebrations, and manage my own household without assistance. My doctor says my health is excellent. My accountant says my business decisions are sound, and my attorney says my legal affairs are properly structured. What exactly am I too old or incapable to handle? Another long pause. When Michael spoke again, his voice was smaller, less certain. I guess when you put it that way, it does sound like you're managing everything fine. But Jessica says you've been acting defensive lately, getting upset about things that are meant to be helpful. She's worried that pride might be keeping you from accepting assistance you actually need. The manipulation was masterful. Jessica had positioned herself as the concerned family member trying to help a proud elderly woman who couldn't acknowledge her own declining capabilities. Any resistance to her help became evidence of the very problem she was trying to address. Any assertion of competence became defensive pride that proved the need for intervention. It was a perfectly circular argument that made meaningful pushback nearly impossible. Michael, I said, deciding it was time for complete honesty. Jessica hasn't been offering help. She's been systematically undermining my confidence and autonomy. She monitors and controls what I eat in my own home, suggesting I'm too old to make appropriate food choices. She questions my business decisions despite having no relevant experience or expertise. She treats me like a child who needs supervision rather than an adult who deserves respect. That's not how she sees it, Michael replied defensively. She's just trying to look out for you because she cares. Maybe you're misinterpreting her intentions. The response revealed how completely Jessica had managed to control the narrative, positioning herself as the caring daughter-in-law, and me as the misguided elderly woman misunderstanding loving concern as disrespect. Then let me be very clear about my intentions, I said firmly. The new lease terms take effect January 1st. The property inspection happens Thursday as scheduled. These are business decisions that aren't open to negotiation or emotional appeals. You and Jessica can accept the new terms, find alternative housing, or discuss with Linda Thompson whether you think my business judgment is legally questionable. The mention of my attorney seemed to shift something in Michael's understanding. You've talked to a lawyer about this? Mom, that seems like overkill for a family rental situation. But his tone carried less conviction now, as if he was beginning to realize that I might be more serious and more prepared than he'd initially assumed. I consult with Linda on all significant property decisions, I replied calmly. That's what competent business owners do. They get professional advice before making major changes to legal agreements. The implication was clear. I was operating as a professional property owner with legal counsel, not as an emotional family member making impulsive decisions. The conversation ended with Michael promising to discuss the situation with Jessica and get back to me about their decision regarding the new lease terms. But his tone had shifted noticeably during our talk, from confident dismissal of my concerns to uncertainty about the narrative he'd been accepting. For perhaps the first time, he was questioning whether Jessica's characterization of me as declining and defensive might not align with the evidence of competence and preparation I was demonstrating. The property inspection the following Thursday proved even more revealing than I'd anticipated. Frank Rodriguez, the professional inspector I'd hired, was thorough and methodical, documenting not just the maintenance issues I'd observed from the street, but interior problems that suggested systematic neglect of basic tenant responsibilities. The hardwood floors showed water damage near the kitchen sink, indicating either a leak that hadn't been reported or spills that hadn't been properly cleaned. The bathroom grout was discolored with what appeared to be mold growth. Several interior walls had nail holes and scuff marks that went well beyond normal wear and tear. Mrs. Williams, Frank said as he completed his documentation, this level of maintenance neglect is concerning, especially since the tenants have only been here 8 months. The water damage suggests ongoing issues that should have been reported immediately. The mold situation could become a serious health hazard if not addressed promptly. And these wall modifications were definitely done without landlord permission. Most disturbing was Frank's discovery that Jessica and Michael had apparently been subletting the basement rec room to a college student without informing me, or including the additional occupant on the lease agreement. Personal belongings, AEE, mattress, and makeshift living arrangements clearly indicated someone was residing in the space on a regular basis. This is a significant lease violation, Frank explained. Unauthorized occupants create liability issues and potentially violate local housing regulations. The inspection report Frank provided was 12 pages of detailed findings, photographs, and recommendations for addressing maintenance issues and lease violations. The document made clear that Michael and Jessica had not been maintaining the property appropriately and had violated several significant terms of their lease agreement. More importantly, it provided objective evidence that my concerns about their tenancy were legitimate business issues, rather than personal grievances or age-related confusion. Armed with Frank's report, I called Linda Thompson to discuss next steps. This changes things significantly. Linda said after reviewing the inspection findings. You now have documented lease violations that justify immediate action. The unauthorized occupant alone is grounds for eviction if they don't remedy the situation promptly. We discussed options ranging from formal notices to cure violations to immediate termination of the tenancy based on material breaches of the lease agreement. What I recommend, Linda continued, is giving them one opportunity to address all violations within 30 days. If they comply fully, remove the unauthorized occupant, repair all damage, bring maintenance up to standard, then you can proceed with the new lease terms in January. If they don't comply, or if they continue to treat this as a family negotiation rather than a business requirement, then you serve them with termination notice. The formal notice to cure or quit that Linda prepared was comprehensive and legally precise, detailing each violation found during the inspection and specifying exactly what actions were required within 30 days to avoid lease termination. The document made clear that failure to comply with any requirement would result in eviction proceedings, and that future violations of lease terms would not be tolerated regardless of family relationships. I hand-delivered the notice on a Friday evening, wanting to ensure that both Michael and Jessica were present to receive it simultaneously. Jessica answered the door with her usual bright smile, but her expression changed dramatically when she saw the official legal document in my hands. "What's this about, Pat?" she asked, her tone still attempting warmth but with an underlying edge that suggested she sensed trouble. "Property inspection results and required corrective actions," I replied formally, handing her the envelope. "Everything's documented and explained in detail. You have 30 days to address all violations, or your tenancy will be terminated." I turned to leave without further explanation, but Jessica's voice stopped me at the bottom of the porch steps. "Pat, wait. Can we talk about this like family instead of strangers? I'm sure whatever issues you found can be worked out without all this legal paperwork." Her tone had shifted to the concerned, patient voice she used when treating me like a confused elderly person who needed gentle guidance back to reasonableness. "We tried talking like family," I replied without turning around. "That approach led to property damage, lease violations, and disrespectful behavior that I won't tolerate any longer. Now we're talking like landlord and tenant, which means legal documents and business consequences." I continued walking to my car, leaving Jessica standing on the porch with the notice in her hands, and probably the first genuine uncertainty she'd felt in months about her ability to control this situation. The next few days were tense but revealing. Sarah called to report that Jessica had contacted her, apparently hoping to get my older daughter to intervene on their behalf. "She wanted me to talk to you about being more flexible with Michael," Sarah explained. "Said you were being unreasonably rigid, and that families should work together to solve problems rather than threatening each other with evictions." Sarah's response had been diplomatically brutal. I told her that maybe if she'd treated you with respect from the beginning, you wouldn't have had to resort to legal remedies to get appropriate behavior. I also mentioned that I'd witnessed her making inappropriate comments about your age and capabilities, so I understood why you felt the need to establish clearer boundaries. More interesting was Mary Johnson's call. My neighbor and longtime friend had been watching the situation unfold with the perspective of someone who'd known me for 20 years and had no investment in family dynamics. "Pat, I hope you don't mind, but Jessica stopped by yesterday afternoon. She seemed to be fishing for information about whether I'd noticed any changes in your behavior or judgment lately." The implication was clear. Jessica was trying to build a case that I was acting irrationally due to age-related cognitive decline, perhaps hoping to gather evidence that could be used to challenge my legal actions or question my competency. "What did you tell her?" I asked, curious about how Jessica was presenting the situation to people outside the family. "I told her that you seem sharper and more energetic than ever," Mary replied with satisfaction. "Mentioned that you'd been handling that difficult tenant situation on Elm Street beautifully, that your garden looked better than it had in years. and that our book club members always looked forward to your insights during discussions. I think I disappointed her by not providing the concerned observation she was hoping for. The pattern was becoming clear. Jessica wasn't just trying to resolve the immediate housing situation, she was working to undermine my credibility and decision-making authority by suggesting to anyone who would listen that my actions were the result of declining mental function rather than legitimate business concerns. It was a sophisticated strategy that could potentially damage my reputation in the community while positioning her as the reasonable family member trying to protect an elderly relative from her own poor judgment. But Jessica had underestimated both my preparation and my network of relationships. Linda Thompson's legal advice had given me unassailable grounds for my actions. Frank Rodriguez's inspection report provided objective documentation of lease violations. Bob Chen's records showed consistent professional property management across my entire portfolio, and longtime friends like Mary Johnson could attest to my continued competence and sharp judgment in all areas of my life. As the 30-day deadline approached, it became clear that Michael and Jessica were struggling to comply with the requirements outlined in the notice. The unauthorized occupant had moved out, but the property repairs were extensive and expensive. The water damage required professional restoration services. The mold remediation needed specialized treatment. The wall repairs and repainting were time-consuming and costly. Most significantly, bringing the landscaping and exterior maintenance up to standard required more physical labor and financial investment than they'd apparently anticipated. Michael called on day 26, his voice strained with stress and exhaustion. "Mom, we're trying to get everything done, but it's overwhelming. The repair estimates are thousands of dollars, and we're already stretched thin financially. Is there any way we could work out a payment plan or extended timeline for some of these repairs?" The request was reasonable from a practical standpoint, but I recognized it as the beginning of the negotiation phase that would likely lead to partial compliance, extended deadlines, and eventual return to the informal arrangements that had created problems in the first place. The requirements were clearly stated and the timeline was appropriate for the scope of work needed, I replied firmly. If you can't meet the deadline, then we proceed with lease termination as outlined in the notice. But Mom, we're family. Doesn't that count for something? We're not trying to take advantage of you. We're just going through a rough financial period and could use some flexibility. Michael's appeal to family loyalty was predictable, but it missed the fundamental point that family relationships had been damaged by the very behavior patterns I was now trying to address through formal boundaries. Being family is exactly why this situation is so disappointing, I said gently but firmly. I expected family members to treat my property with respect, to communicate honestly about problems, and to recognize that below-market rent was a generous gift that should inspire gratitude rather than entitlement. Instead, I got damaged property, unauthorized occupants, and systematic disrespect disguised as concern for my well-being. The deadline passed with partial compliance at best. The unauthorized occupant was gone, and some cosmetic repairs had been completed, but the major maintenance issues remained unaddressed, and the exterior property care was still substandard. According to the legal timeline Linda had established, I was now within my rights to begin eviction proceedings based on material breach of lease terms. The formal eviction notice I served on December 1st was perhaps the most difficult document I'd ever had to deliver to a family member. But it was also the clearest statement I could make about the boundaries I was no longer willing to compromise. Jessica opened the door with an expression that had shifted from fake concern to barely concealed anger, the mask of caring daughter-in-law finally slipping to reveal the calculation underneath. "So this is really how you want to handle family problems," she said, taking the envelope with obvious reluctance. "Throwing your own son and his wife out on the street because we couldn't meet your impossible standards in an unreasonable time frame." Her voice carried the injured tone of someone who'd been victimized by unreasonable demands, but her eyes held something much colder and more calculating. "I want to handle family problems by establishing that family members don't get to treat me with disrespect just because they assume I won't enforce consequences," I replied evenly. You have 60 days to find alternative housing. That should be adequate time to locate something within your budget and arrange for the transition. Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. You know what, Pat? Maybe it's time someone told you the truth. You're a bitter, controlling old woman who can't stand that your son has a life and a wife who doesn't revolve around your needs. This whole property management thing is just your way of staying relevant and powerful when everyone can see that you're past your prime. The verbal attack was designed to wound, to make me doubt myself and retreat from the position I'd established. But instead of feeling hurt or defensive, I felt something closer to relief. The pretense was finally over. The fake concern and manipulative kindness had been stripped away to reveal the fundamental disrespect that had been driving Jessica's behavior all along. She didn't see me as an elderly relative who needed protection. She saw me as an obstacle to be managed and controlled. Thank you for your honesty, I said calmly. It confirms that this situation needed formal boundaries rather than continued attempts at family diplomacy. You have 60 days. I suggest you use them productively. I turned and walked back to my car, leaving Jessica standing in the doorway with the eviction notice in her hands, and perhaps the first realization that her strategy of manipulation and control had finally met its match. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. The confrontation I'd been dreading for months had finally occurred, and instead of being devastated by it, I felt liberated. Jessica's true feelings were now out in the open, which meant I no longer had to question whether I was misinterpreting her behavior or being oversensitive about her comments. The disrespect was real, it was intentional, and it was unacceptable regardless of family relationships. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that age didn't automatically equal vulnerability, that experience could be a source of strength rather than limitation, and that setting appropriate boundaries was an act of self-respect rather than selfishness. Jessica had underestimated the 68-year-old woman she'd been systematically undermining, and that miscalculation was about to cost her the comfortable, below-market housing arrangement she'd been taking for granted while treating me like an incompetent burden. The real reckoning, however, was still to come. The 60 days following the eviction notice created a strange kind of limbo in our family dynamics. Jessica's mask had been completely removed during our final confrontation, but the practical reality of finding new housing meant that Michael and she couldn't simply disappear from our lives immediately. They needed time to secure alternative arrangements, which meant continued contact as they navigated their housing crisis, while I maintained my position as the landlord, enforcing consequences for their behavior. Michael's calls during this period revealed a man caught between loyalty to his wife and dawning recognition of the situation's complexity. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly," he said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Jessica, keep saying that you're using the property situation to punish us for personal reasons, that this isn't really about maintenance issues or lease violations. Is there truth to that?" The question gave me an opportunity to address the underlying family dynamics that had made formal boundaries necessary. "Michael, let me ask you something in return. Over the past year, have you noticed changes in how Jessica speaks to me or about me? Have you observed her making comments about my age, my capabilities, or my decision-making that seemed dismissive or condescending?" There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of reluctant recognition. "I guess there have been some comments about you maybe needing to slow down, or suggestions that you might be taking on too much responsibility for someone your age. But I thought she was just being concerned, looking out for your well-being." "And how did those comments make you feel?" I pressed gently. "When your wife suggested that your mother was too old to manage her own business, too incapable to choose her own food portions, too limited to make appropriate decisions about her own life, what was your reaction?" The questions were designed to help Michael examine his own responses to Jessica's behavior, rather than simply defending her intentions. Another pause, longer this time. I guess I felt uncomfortable sometimes, like maybe she was being a little too focused on age-related stuff. But she seemed to know a lot about health and nutrition, and she was always so concerned about everyone's well-being. His voice trailed off as if he was reconsidering memories in light of our conversation. Michael, concern shows up as asking if someone needs help and accepting their answer. Control shows up as insisting someone needs help despite their protests and making decisions for them regardless of their preferences. Which pattern better describes Jessica's behavior toward me? I kept my tone neutral, letting him reach his own conclusions rather than pushing him toward a specific response. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it in years. When you put it that way, I can see how some of her comments might have felt controlling rather than caring. I just didn't think about it from your perspective because she was always so positive about wanting to help and protect you. The difference between help and control, I said gently, is whether the person being helped has requested assistance and maintains the right to decline it. Jessica never asked if I wanted her guidance about my eating habits, my business decisions, or my lifestyle choices. She simply assumed that my age gave her the authority to provide that guidance whether I wanted it or not. This conversation represented a breakthrough in Michael's understanding of the situation, but it also created new complications. He was beginning to recognize that his wife's behavior toward his mother had been inappropriate, but he was also facing the practical reality that challenging Jessica's narrative would require him to acknowledge his own role in enabling her disrespectful treatment of me. The cognitive dissonance was evident in his increasingly strained voice as we continued talking. "So, what happens now?" he asked finally. "Are we really going to be homeless because Jessica made some inappropriate comments about age and eating habits? That seems like a pretty extreme consequence for what you're describing." The question revealed that he still didn't fully grasp the scope of the problem or the significance of the property violations that had provided legal grounds for the eviction. "Michael, the eviction isn't happening because of inappropriate comments," I clarified. "The eviction is happening because of documented lease violations, property damage, and unauthorized occupants that were discovered during a professional inspection. The disrespectful behavior created the circumstances that led to the inspection, but the legal action is based on objective violations of your lease agreement." I could hear him processing this distinction, perhaps for the first time understanding that the formal legal proceedings weren't simply a personal retaliation, but a legitimate business response to documented problems. "I didn't realize the property issues were that serious," he admitted. "Jessica handled most of the communication about house stuff, and she said the inspection was just you being nitpicky about minor maintenance things." The revelation that Jessica had been filtering and minimizing information about the property violations was significant. It suggested that she'd been managing Michael's understanding of the situation just as she'd been managing everyone else's perceptions, ensuring that he didn't have access to the full scope of information that might have led him to question her behavior or take corrective action. "The inspection report is 12 pages of documented violations and repair requirements," I said. "Frank Rodriguez is a licensed professional who's inspected hundreds of properties. His findings weren't nitpicky. They were serious maintenance issues and clear lease violations that would justify eviction proceedings for any tenant, regardless of family relationships." Michael asked if he could review the inspection report himself, a request that surprised me because it suggested he was finally ready to examine the objective evidence rather than simply accepting Jessica's interpretation of events. When I agreed to provide him with a copy, he seemed both relieved and apprehensive, as if he understood that reading the document might force him to confront uncomfortable truths about his wife's handling of their rental situation. The conversation ended with Michael promising to review the inspection findings and discuss them with Jessica, though his tone suggested he was dreading that conversation. For the first time since this situation began, I felt cautiously optimistic that my son might be starting to see the fuller picture of what had been happening and why formal boundaries had become necessary. Bob Chen called the next morning with an update that complicated the situation further. "Mrs. Williams, I've been contacted by several other property owners in the neighborhood asking about the Williams tenants at Oak Avenue. Apparently, there have been complaints about noise, parking, issues, and what looks like commercial activity being conducted from the residents." The news was troubling on multiple levels. Not only had Michael and Jessica been violating the terms of their lease agreement, but their behavior was apparently affecting the broader neighborhood in ways that could impact property values and community relationships. "What kind of commercial activity?" I asked, though I had a growing suspicion about what Bob might have discovered. "It appears that Mrs. Jessica Williams has been running some kind of consulting business from the house," Bob explained. "Neighbors report regular meetings with clients, people coming and going at all hours, and what looks like business signage posted in the front windows. There's also been complaints about the driveway being blocked by client vehicles, which is forcing visitors to park on the street and causing traffic flow problems. The unauthorized business operation was a significant lease violation that I hadn't discovered during Frank's inspection, probably because Jessica had been careful to schedule her business activities when she knew inspections weren't happening. But running a commercial enterprise from a residential rental property without landlord permission violated both lease terms and local zoning regulations, potentially creating liability issues that could affect my property insurance and municipal standing. Has anyone filed formal complaints with the city?" I asked, concerned about potential legal ramifications that could extend beyond the immediate landlord-tenant dispute. The last thing I needed was to be dealing with zoning violations or business licensing issues because of Jessica's unauthorized activities. "Not yet," Bob replied, "but I get the impression that neighbors are pretty frustrated and might escalate if the situation doesn't improve soon. Mrs. Patterson from across the street mentioned that she's been keeping a log of the disruptions, which suggests she's thinking about formal action." Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was a retired teacher in her 70s who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and took great pride in maintaining community standards. If she was documenting problems and considering formal complaints, the situation was probably more serious than Bob's initial description suggested. Eleanor didn't get involved in disputes lightly, but when she did, she was thorough and persistent. I asked Bob to reach out to Eleanor and the other concerned neighbors to gather more specific information about the commercial activities and their impact on the community. "I need to understand the full scope of what's been happening before I decide how to address it," I explained. "If Jessica's been running a business without proper licensing or permits, this could become a legal issue that extends well beyond our landlord-tenant relationship." The conversation with Bob left me feeling overwhelmed by the expanding complications of what had started as a family dispute about respect and boundaries. Every layer of investigation seemed to reveal new problems, new violations, and new consequences that I hadn't anticipated when I'd first decided to formalize the rental arrangement. But it also reinforced my conviction that establishing proper boundaries had been necessary. The informal family approach had clearly allowed Jessica to take advantage of my trust in ways that were now affecting multiple people, and potentially violating various laws and regulations. Linda Thompson's response to the business operation discovery was swift and decisive. "This changes our timeline significantly," she said after I briefed her on Bob's findings. "Unauthorized commercial use of residential property is a material breach of lease terms that justifies immediate eviction proceedings. We don't have to wait for the 60-day timeline we originally established." The legal implications were more serious than I'd realized. Running a business from a residential rental without proper permits and landlord consent creates liability issues for the property owner, Linda explained. "If someone gets injured during a business meeting, if there are parking accidents related to commercial traffic, if the city finds the property for zoning violations, all of that liability potentially falls on you as the property owner." Linda recommended that I serve an immediate notice to cease the commercial activities within 72 hours or face expedited eviction proceedings. We can also file complaints with the city about unauthorized business activities and zoning violations, which would create additional pressure for them to comply with lease terms or vacate the property. The escalation felt both necessary and overwhelming. What had begun as an attempt to establish appropriate boundaries in a family relationship was now involving municipal regulations, potential legal liability, and neighborhood disputes that could affect my standing in the community. But Linda's advice was clear. Ignoring the commercial violations would expose me to serious financial and legal risks that far exceeded the personal discomfort of family conflict. I spent that evening drafting a certified letter to Michael and Jessica outlining the newly discovered lease violations and requiring immediate cessation of all commercial activities. The letter detailed the neighbor complaints, the zoning violations, and the liability issues created by their unauthorized business operations. Most importantly, it made clear that continued commercial use of the property would result in immediate eviction proceedings regardless of the original 60-day timeline. Delivering this letter felt like crossing a point of no return in my relationship with Michael and Jessica. The previous notices had been formal, but still framed within the context of giving them opportunities to correct problems and maintain their tenancy. This letter was essentially an ultimatum: stop the business operations immediately or face immediate eviction with no additional chances for compliance. Jessica's response came not as a phone call or visit, but as a letter delivered by courier the next morning. The formal tone and legal language suggested she'd consulted with an attorney, which elevated the entire situation to a new level of adversarial formality that made reconciliation increasingly unlikely. "Mrs. Williams," the letter began, "we are in receipt of your communication dated December 8th regarding alleged commercial activities at the Oak Avenue property. We dispute your characterization of these activities as commercial in nature and question the validity of anonymous neighbor complaints as grounds for lease termination. The activities you describe constitute personal consultation services provided on a limited basis to friends and family members, which fall well within normal residential use parameters." The letter went on to challenge my authority to restrict what Jessica termed personal activities, and suggested that my actions constituted harassment of tenants based on personal animosity rather than legitimate business concerns. Most troubling was the final paragraph, which hinted at potential legal action against me for what Jessica characterized as discriminatory treatment based on age-related bias and family relationship retaliation. "We reserve all rights to pursue appropriate legal remedies if these harassing communications continue," the letter concluded. "We also intend to file complaints with appropriate authorities regarding landlord harassment and potentially discriminatory enforcement of lease terms that appear targeted at our family relationships rather than based on objective property management standards." The threat of discrimination claims was particularly concerning because it suggested that Jessica was prepared to argue that my actions were motivated by personal bias rather than legitimate business concerns. If she could convince a court or administrative agency that I was using property management as a weapon against family members who had somehow offended me, it could potentially invalidate the eviction proceedings and create significant legal problems for my business. Linda Thompson's reaction to Jessica's letter was both reassuring and sobering. "This is a common tactic when tenants are facing legitimate eviction proceedings," she explained. "They often claim harassment or discrimination to shift focus away from their lease violations and create doubt about the landlord's motivations. But in this case, we have extensive documentation of objective violations that support your actions." Linda reviewed the timeline of events, the inspection reports, the neighbor complaints, and the photographic evidence of unauthorized business activities. "Any reasonable court would see that your actions have been consistently based on documented lease violations rather than personal animosity," she concluded. "The discrimination claim is particularly weak because you can demonstrate that you've followed the same procedures and standards you use for all your rental properties." However, Linda also warned that defending against discrimination claims could be time-consuming and expensive, even when the claims were baseless. Jessica seems sophisticated enough to know that threatening legal action might pressure you to back down or agree to more favorable terms, she observed. The question is whether you're prepared to continue enforcing appropriate boundaries, even if it means dealing with frivolous legal challenges. The answer to that question had been clear in my mind since the first time Jessica had publicly humiliated me about my food choices in my own home. I was not going to be intimidated, manipulated, or controlled by someone who had systematically undermined my dignity and autonomy. If enforcing appropriate consequences required dealing with legal threats and discrimination claims, then that was a cost I was prepared to accept. Proceed with the eviction, I told Linda firmly. File whatever responses are necessary to address her threats, but don't let them delay the process of removing tenants who have violated their lease terms and treated both the property and the landlord with consistent disrespect. Linda nodded approvingly, perhaps recognizing that I had moved beyond the point where family relationships could be used to pressure me into accepting unacceptable behavior. The formal eviction proceedings that followed were methodical and professional, with Linda ensuring that every step was properly documented and legally defensible. The unauthorized business activities were photographed and cataloged. The neighbor complaints were formalized with signed statements. The property violations were independently verified by multiple inspectors. The timeline of events was carefully documented to demonstrate that my actions had been consistently based on objective business concerns rather than personal animosity. Michael made one final attempt to negotiate a resolution before the court hearing. "Mom, can we please try to work this out as a family instead of letting lawyers handle everything?" he pleaded during a phone call that felt emotionally exhausting for both of us. I know Jessica's made some mistakes, and I know we've let some property maintenance slide, but does it really have to end with us being evicted by my own mother? The pain in his voice was genuine, and I felt the full weight of maternal guilt that came with enforcing consequences that would cause hardship for my child. But I also recognized that backing down now would simply return us to the dysfunctional patterns that had created this situation in the first place. Michael, working it out as a family would have meant Jessica treating me with respect and you maintaining the property according to lease terms. That didn't happen despite multiple opportunities. But she's willing to change, Michael insisted. She realizes now that some of her comments about your age and health were inappropriate. She's sorry about that, and she's willing to apologize and do better going forward. The offer sounded rehearsed, as if Jessica had coached him on what to say to get me to relent. "Michael, this isn't about apologies or promises to do better," I replied gently but firmly. "This is about patterns of behavior that have damaged our relationship and created serious property management issues. Trust has to be rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not through promises made when consequences are being enforced." The conversation ended with Michael accepting that the eviction would proceed as scheduled, though his tone suggested he felt I was being unnecessarily harsh and unforgiving. I understood his perspective. From his viewpoint, I was choosing legal procedures over family relationships, allowing business concerns to override maternal love. But from my perspective, I was finally choosing self-respect over enabling behavior that had been systematically undermining my dignity and autonomy. The actual eviction hearing was surprisingly brief and straightforward. Linda presented the 4 documented lease violations, the inspection reports, the unauthorized business activities, and the neighbor complaints in a clear, organized fashion that left little room for dispute. Jessica's attorney tried to raise questions about discriminatory enforcement and family relationship retaliation, but the judge seemed unimpressed by arguments that weren't supported by evidence. "Mrs. Williams has documented multiple material breaches of the lease agreement," the judge concluded after reviewing the evidence. "The tenant's family relationship to the landlord doesn't create special exemptions from lease compliance or provide grounds for claiming discriminatory treatment when violations are properly addressed through established legal procedures." The eviction order was granted with a 30-day timeline for the tenants to vacate the property. Jessica's final gambit, claiming discrimination and harassment, had failed to convince a court that wasn't swayed by emotional arguments unsupported by evidence. The legal system had validated my position that family relationships didn't excuse inappropriate behavior or lease violations, and that property owners had both the right and the responsibility to enforce appropriate standards regardless of personal connections to tenants. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. The legal process had been stressful and emotionally draining, but it had also proven that my concerns were legitimate and my actions were justified. I wasn't a vindictive old woman using property ownership to punish family members who had offended me. I was a competent business owner enforcing reasonable standards for property maintenance and tenant behavior. The 30 days between the court order and the final eviction date passed with minimal contact between Michael, Jessica, and me. They were busy finding alternative housing and arranging their move, while I was focused on preparing the Oak Avenue property for new tenants, who would hopefully treat both the house and the landlord with appropriate respect. The silence felt strange after months of conflict, but it also felt necessary. A cooling-off period that might eventually allow for rebuilding family relationships on healthier foundations. Sarah served as an informal mediator during this period, maintaining contact with Michael to ensure that practical moving arrangements were handled smoothly, while avoiding the emotional intensity that had characterized my direct interactions with Jessica. "He seems to be understanding more about what happened," Sarah reported after one of their conversations. "I think he's starting to realize that Jessica's behavior toward you wasn't appropriate, even if he's not ready to admit it openly yet." The possibility that Michael might eventually recognize the full scope of what had occurred gave me hope that our family relationships could eventually be repaired. But it also made clear that any reconciliation would require Jessica to acknowledge her behavior and make genuine changes, not just offer apologies designed to restore her access to below-market housing and family financial support. As the eviction deadline approached, I found myself surprisingly calm about the outcome. The process had been difficult and emotionally costly, but it had also been necessary and ultimately successful. I had proven to myself and to others that age didn't automatically equal vulnerability, that experience could be a source of strength rather than limitation, and that self-respect was worth fighting for even when the battle involved family members and legal complications. The woman who had started this journey feeling diminished and disrespected by her daughter-in-law's constant comments about age and capability had emerged as someone who refused to accept inappropriate treatment regardless of its source. The property owner, who had been afraid to enforce lease terms because of family relationships, had discovered that professional boundaries actually strengthened rather than weakened important relationships by establishing mutual respect and clear expectations. Most importantly, I had learned that kindness without boundaries isn't really kindness at all. It's enabling behavior that ultimately harms everyone involved by allowing problems to escalate rather than addressing them directly and appropriately. The eviction notice I had served Jessica wasn't an act of cruelty or revenge. It was an act of self-respect that had become necessary when other approaches failed to produce appropriate behavior and mutual respect. The actual moving day arrived on a crisp January morning, 3 months after I had first decided that Jessica's disrespectful behavior needed formal consequences. I watched from my kitchen window as the rental truck pulled into the Oak Avenue driveway, followed by Michael's sedan and a car I didn't recognize. The systematic loading of furniture and boxes that followed looked like any other family relocation, but it carried the weight of broken relationships and hard-learned lessons about boundaries and self-respect. Bob Chen had volunteered to be present during the move-out to document the property's condition and ensure that the transition proceeded smoothly without additional drama. His call came around noon with a report that was both relieving and revealing. "The house is in better condition than I expected," he said, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "They've actually repaired most of the maintenance issues that were identified in Frank's inspection, and they've cleaned everything thoroughly. It looks like they took the property requirements seriously once they realized the eviction was actually going to happen. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica and Michael had been capable of maintaining the property appropriately all along. They simply hadn't felt motivated to do so until they faced real consequences for their negligence. The repairs and cleaning that had been impossible to complete within the original 30-day timeline had somehow been accomplished once they understood that their housing actually depended on meeting reasonable landlord expectations. "There's one other thing," Bob continued. "Mrs. Jessica left an envelope addressed to you. She asked me to make sure you received it after they finished moving out." The existence of a final communication from Jessica intrigued and concerned me in equal measure. Given her previous pattern of manipulation and blame-shifting, I wasn't optimistic about the contents, but I was curious about what she felt needed to be said now that the legal proceedings were concluded, and she was moving on to housing arrangements that didn't involve my family. The envelope, when Bob delivered it that evening, was thick and formal, suggesting more than a brief note of apology or explanation. Jessica's handwriting on the outside was careful and precise, much like everything else about her presentation, and the weight of the contents suggested multiple pages of whatever message she'd decided to leave behind. I waited until after dinner to open the letter, settling into my favorite reading chair with a cup of tea and the mental preparation that comes with expecting either genuine reflection or sophisticated manipulation. What I found was something more complex and unexpected than either of those alternatives. A letter that revealed both Jessica's genuine understanding of what had happened and her continued inability to accept full responsibility for her role in creating the situation. "Dear Patricia," the letter began, using my formal name rather than the casual Pat she'd employed throughout our relationship. "I want you to know that I understand why you felt it necessary to evict us, and I acknowledge that my behavior toward you was inappropriate in ways that I'm only now beginning to recognize fully. The past few months have forced me to examine my attitudes and actions, and I realize that I allowed my concerns about age-related issues to manifest in ways that were condescending and disrespectful." The opening paragraphs continued in this vein, acknowledging specific incidents and behaviors that had contributed to the deterioration of our relationship. Jessica admitted that her comments about my eating habits had been controlling rather than caring, that her suggestions about my business capabilities had been presumptuous and insulting, and that her general attitude had treated me as someone who needed management rather than someone who deserved respect. "I genuinely believed I was being helpful and protective," she wrote, "but I can see now that I was actually being paternalistic and dismissive. You never asked for my guidance about your nutrition, your business decisions, or your lifestyle choices, and I had no right to provide that guidance simply because I assumed that age created vulnerability that required my intervention." Arguer. The self-awareness demonstrated in these admissions was more sophisticated than I had expected from Jessica, suggesting that the consequences of her behavior had prompted genuine reflection rather than simply strategic damage control. However, as the letter continued, it became clear that her understanding of the situation remained incomplete in ways that revealed ongoing blind spots about personal responsibility and relationship dynamics. "I think part of the problem was that I was projecting my own fears about aging and independence," Jessica continued. "My grandmother developed dementia in her early 70s, and watching her decline was traumatic for our entire family. When I met you, I was probably hypervigilant about signs of cognitive or physical decline because I was so afraid of not recognizing them early enough to provide appropriate support." The explanation offered context for Jessica's behavior, but it also demonstrated her continued tendency to frame her actions as well-intentioned mistakes rather than choices that had systematically undermined my autonomy and dignity. She was still positioning herself as someone who had cared too much, rather than someone who had failed to respect basic boundaries and treat me as a competent adult, capable of making my own decisions. "I also want to acknowledge that the property maintenance issues were unacceptable," the letter continued. "We were overwhelmed by financial pressures and personal stress, but that doesn't excuse our failure to maintain your house according to the lease terms. You trusted us with a valuable property at below-market rates, and we took advantage of that generosity by letting standards slip in ways that could have damaged both the house and your investment. This admission was more straightforward and less self-justifying than her explanations about age-related concerns, perhaps because property maintenance was more objectively measurable than interpersonal dynamics. The water damage, the unauthorized occupant, and the commercial activities were clear violations that couldn't be explained away as misguided caring or protective instincts. The business activities were a mistake in judgment, Jessica continued. I was trying to supplement our income during a difficult financial period, but I should have discussed it with you first and obtained proper permissions. Running consulting services from your property without your knowledge or consent was a violation of trust that compounded the other problems we were already having. The acknowledgement of the business violations was important, but it was also framed in ways that minimized the seriousness of what had occurred. Jessica described her unauthorized commercial activities as a mistake in judgment, rather than a deliberate decision to use my property for purposes that violated both lease terms and local regulations. She was still presenting herself as someone who had made errors rather than someone who had knowingly engaged in behavior that created legal and financial risks for me. The final section of the letter shifted to more personal reflections about family relationships and the consequences of the eviction for her marriage to Michael. This situation has created significant strain between Michael and me, Jessica wrote. He's struggling with divided loyalties between his wife and his mother, and I realize that my behavior put him in an impossible position where defending me meant accepting disrespect toward you, while supporting you meant acknowledging serious flaws in my judgment and actions. This observation suggested that Jessica understood how her behavior had affected not just her relationship with me, but the broader family dynamics that connected all of us. Michael's uncomfortable position throughout the conflict had been evident in his phone calls and conversations. But Jessica's acknowledgement of her role in creating that situation was the first indication that she recognized the collateral damage her actions had caused. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation, the letter concluded. I understand that trust, once broken in the ways that I broke it, cannot be easily repaired through apologies or promises. But I want you to know that this experience has taught me important lessons about respect, boundaries, and the difference between genuine care and controlling behavior. I hope that someday, when enough time has passed, and if I can demonstrate consistent change in my attitudes and actions, we might be able to rebuild some kind of positive relationship for Michael's sake and for the sake of family unity. The letter was signed simply Jessica, without the warm closings that had characterized her earlier communications, acknowledging the formal distance that now existed between us, while leaving open the possibility that this distance might eventually be bridged if appropriate changes occurred over time. Reading Jessica's letter left me with mixed feelings that were difficult to untangle. Her acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior and its impact was more comprehensive than I had expected, suggesting genuine self-reflection rather than purely strategic damage control. However, her continued tendency to explain and contextualize her actions rather than simply accepting responsibility revealed ongoing limitations in her understanding of what had occurred and why consequences had been necessary. Most significantly, the letter made no mention of the systematic nature of her disrespectful behavior or its cumulative impact on my sense of dignity and autonomy. She acknowledged specific incidents and general patterns, but she didn't seem to understand how her consistent treatment of me as an incompetent elderly person had been not just individually hurtful, but collectively demoralizing in ways that had required formal intervention to address. Sarah's reaction to the letter when I shared it with her later that week was more skeptical than mine. It sounds like she's learned to say the right things, my older daughter observed, but I'm not convinced she truly understands what she did or why it was so damaging. The whole tone is still slightly self-justifying, like she's explaining her behavior rather than taking full ownership of it. Sarah's perspective was valuable because she had witnessed many of the incidents that had contributed to the deterioration of my relationship with Jessica, and she had seen firsthand how Jessica's comments and behavior had affected me. The letter sounds like someone who's intellectually understood that her actions had negative consequences, but I don't hear genuine remorse or understanding of how systematically disrespectful she was. The distinction Sarah was making was important. There's a significant difference between understanding that certain behaviors created problems and truly comprehending the impact of those behaviors on another person's dignity and well-being. Jessica's letter demonstrated the former, but left questions about whether she had achieved the latter. Michael's first contact with me after the move-out came 2 weeks later. A phone call that felt tentative and careful in ways that revealed his own ongoing struggle to process what had happened and determine how to move forward with family relationships that had been fundamentally altered by the recent events. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that we're settled in our new place," he said, his voice carrying a formality that was unusual for our typical interactions. "It's a smaller apartment and the rent is higher than what we were paying you, but we're managing okay financially." The update was factual and brief, avoiding any discussion of blame or responsibility while acknowledging the practical consequences of the eviction. "I'm glad you found something suitable," I replied, matching his formal tone while trying to leave space for whatever conversation he might want to have about the broader situation. Michael seemed to be testing the waters, trying to determine whether normal family communication was possible or whether our relationship had been permanently damaged by the landlord-tenant conflict. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," Michael continued after a pause. "I know you felt disrespected by some of Jessica's comments and behavior, and I'm starting to understand that I probably should have spoken up more when I noticed things that made me uncomfortable." The admission was significant because it acknowledged his own role in enabling Jessica's behavior rather than simply focusing on her actions or my reactions. "Michael, you were in a difficult position," I said gently. "Standing up to a spouse about their treatment of family members is complicated, especially when the behavior is subtle and can be explained as caring rather than controlling." I wanted to acknowledge the complexity of his situation without completely excusing his failure to address problems he had obviously noticed. "But that's just it," he replied, his voice gaining strength and clarity. "Looking back, I can see that it wasn't really subtle at all. The comments about your age, the suggestions about what you should eat, the implications that you weren't capable of making good decisions. It was pretty obvious that she was treating you like a child rather than respecting you as an adult." This recognition was more direct and honest than anything Michael had said during the months of conflict, suggesting that distance from the immediate situation had allowed him to see patterns and behaviors more clearly. I think I was so focused on keeping peace and avoiding conflict that I ignored my own discomfort with how she was treating you. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Michael working through his understanding of what had occurred and his regret about not addressing problems earlier. I realize now that by not speaking up when Jessica made inappropriate comments, I was essentially endorsing her behavior and making it worse. "You probably felt like your own son was choosing his wife's disrespectful treatment over defending his mother's dignity." His insight was accurate and painful, touching on one of the most hurtful aspects of the entire situation, the feeling that my own child had witnessed systematic disrespect and chosen to remain silent rather than defend me. "Michael, I never expected you to create conflict in your marriage on my behalf," I said carefully. "But I did hope that you would recognize when behavior crossed the line from caring to controlling." "I should have recognized it," he replied firmly. "And I should have addressed it directly, instead of making excuses for Jessica, or hoping the problem would resolve itself. I let you down as a son, and I let Jessica down as a husband by not helping her understand when her behavior was inappropriate." The acknowledgement of his own responsibility was important for several reasons. It demonstrated that Michael was capable of honest self-reflection, rather than simply choosing sides in a conflict between his wife and mother. It also suggested that he understood the complexity of what had occurred, rather than viewing it as a simple personality clash or misunderstanding that could be easily resolved with apologies and good intentions. Most significantly, Michael's recognition of his enabling role offered hope that future family interactions might be healthier because he had learned to identify and address problematic dynamics before they escalated to the point where formal consequences became necessary. "What happens now?" Michael asked as our conversation drew to a close. "Is there a way for us to rebuild family relationships, or has too much damage been done?" The question revealed both his desire for reconciliation and his uncertainty about whether such reconciliation was possible, given the seriousness of what had occurred. "Michael, I love you and I want to have a positive relationship with you," I said honestly. "But rebuilding trust and respect takes time and consistent behavior, not just good intentions or apologies. Jessica would need to demonstrate through her actions over time that she understands what went wrong and has made genuine changes in how she approaches relationships and boundaries." The timeline I suggested was measured in years rather than months, reflecting my understanding that the patterns of behavior that had created our conflict were deeply ingrained and wouldn't change quickly or easily. I'm not saying reconciliation is impossible, but it would require Jessica to consistently treat me with respect and acknowledge my autonomy without reverting to controlling or condescending behavior when she feels stressed or concerned. Michael accepted this framework, though I could hear disappointment in his voice about the extended timeline and uncertain outcome. "I understand that trust has to be rebuilt gradually," he said. "I just hope that eventually we can get back to being a family that enjoys spending time together rather than walking on eggshells around unresolved issues." The months that followed were marked by careful, limited contact that allowed Michael and me to maintain a relationship while respecting the boundaries that had been established through the eviction process. He called periodically with updates about his life and work, and I shared news about my business and activities. The conversations were pleasant, but somewhat formal, lacking the easy intimacy that had characterized our relationship before Jessica's behavior had created such significant problems. Sarah served as an informal bridge during this period, maintaining contact with Michael while also keeping me informed about their housing situation, Jessica's job situation, and any developments that might affect future family dynamics. "Michael seems to be more assertive with Jessica about respectful behavior," Sarah reported after one of their conversations. "He's not letting her make dismissive comments about age or capability, and he's been more direct about defending family members when she starts getting critical." The changes in Michael's behavior were encouraging because they suggested he had internalized lessons from our conflict and was applying them to prevent similar problems in the future. However, the real test would come when family interactions resumed, and Jessica was once again in situations where she might feel tempted to revert to previous patterns of controlling or condescending behavior. The first significant test came 6 months after the eviction, when Emma, my granddaughter, graduated from 8th grade, and Michael asked if he and Jessica could attend the celebration dinner I was hosting. The request put all of us in an awkward position. Excluding them from a family milestone would be hurtful and potentially damaging to my relationship with my grandchildren, but including them risked creating tension and conflict that could ruin the celebration. After discussing the situation with Sarah and considering the potential outcomes, I agreed to include Michael and Jessica in the graduation dinner, with the understanding that any disrespectful behavior would result in them being asked to leave immediately. "This is Emma's day," I told Michael clearly. "If Jessica can't interact respectfully with everyone present, including me, then you'll need to make other arrangements for celebrating Emma's achievement." The dinner itself was surprisingly pleasant, with Jessica maintaining polite, respectful behavior throughout the evening. She complimented the meal without making any comments about portion sizes or nutritional content. She asked appropriate Questions about my business and activities without offering unwanted advice or suggestions. Most importantly, she treated me as a competent adult whose opinions and decisions deserved respect rather than management. The successful dinner didn't immediately restore our relationship to its previous warmth, but it demonstrated that Jessica was capable of appropriate behavior when she chose to exercise that capability. More significantly, it showed that the boundaries established through the eviction process were being respected, and that Michael was prepared to enforce those boundaries, if necessary. Emma's response to the family tensions was mature and thoughtful in ways that impressed all of the adults present. "I'm glad everyone could be here for my graduation," she said during her thank you speech. "And I hope we can keep having family celebrations where everyone treats each other with kindness and respect." Her diplomatic observation acknowledged the recent difficulties without taking sides or creating additional conflict. The gradual rebuilding of family relationships continued over the following year, with Jessica consistently demonstrating more respectful behavior and Michael showing increased awareness of problematic dynamics. Holiday celebrations were successful, family birthdays were celebrated without incident, and the casual interactions that make family relationships enjoyable slowly began to resurface. However, the fundamental power dynamic had shifted permanently. Jessica no longer assumed that she could make decisions for me or offer unsolicited guidance about my life choices. Michael no longer remained silent when behavior crossed appropriate boundaries. And I no longer prioritized family harmony over self-respect when those two values came into conflict. The Oak Avenue property was rented to a young couple with excellent references who maintained it beautifully and treated me with consistent professionalism and respect. The difference between their approach to the landlord-tenant relationship and the casual disregard that Michael and Jessica had shown was stark, and reinforced my conviction that family relationships don't excuse inappropriate behavior or create exemptions from reasonable expectations. 2 years after the eviction, Michael and Jessica invited me to their new apartment for a dinner they had prepared to celebrate my 70th birthday. The invitation itself was significant because it represented their recognition that rebuilding our relationship required effort and initiative on their part, rather than simply expecting me to overlook past problems in the name of family unity. The evening was genuinely pleasant, with Jessica demonstrating cooking skills I hadn't known she possessed, and Michael showing pride in their modest but well-maintained living space. The conversation flowed naturally, covering topics ranging from my grandchildren's activities to my business expansion plans to Jessica's new position as assistant manager at a different retail location. Most importantly, Jessica's behavior throughout the evening reflected genuine respect for my autonomy and judgment. When I complimented their apartment's decoration, she thanked me graciously without deflecting or minimizing the praise. When I mentioned my recent decision to hire additional help for property maintenance, she asked interested questions without suggesting that I was taking on too much responsibility or needed more comprehensive assistance. "Patricia, I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to rebuild our relationship," Jessica said as the evening was ending. "I know I did serious damage to your trust and respect, and I appreciate your willingness to let me demonstrate that I've learned from those mistakes." The acknowledgement was simple and direct, without the explanations and justifications that had characterized her earlier apologies. "We all make mistakes," I replied diplomatically. "What matters is learning from them and doing better going forward." The response was generous without being naive, acknowledging positive changes while maintaining appropriate caution about future interactions. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us from the point where Jessica was publicly humiliating me about my food choices to a pleasant family dinner, where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, and it had required enforcing consequences that were painful for everyone involved. But the woman who had started this story feeling diminished and disrespected by ageist assumptions had emerged as someone who refused to accept inappropriate treatment regardless of its source or the family relationships that might complicate addressing it. The property owner, who had been afraid to enforce lease terms because of family dynamics, had learned that professional boundaries actually strengthen relationships by establishing mutual respect and clear expectations. Most importantly, I had discovered that self-respect isn't selfish, that boundaries aren't cruel, and that standing up for appropriate treatment doesn't make someone difficult or unforgiving. It makes them someone who understands their own worth and insists that others recognize it as well. The eviction notice I had served on Jessica wasn't ultimately about property management or lease violations, though those provided the legal framework for addressing the problem. It was about refusing to accept systematic disrespect from someone who had assumed that age created vulnerability and that family relationships created immunity from consequences. Jessica had learned that being 30 years younger than me didn't give her the authority to manage my choices or treat me like a child who needed supervision. Michael had learned that keeping peace in his marriage couldn't come at the cost of allowing his wife to disrespect his mother. And I had learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for family members is to enforce boundaries that require them to treat you with the dignity and respect that every person deserves, regardless of age, relationship status, or any other factor that might be used to justify inappropriate behavior. The full plate that Jessica had once suggested I didn't need at my age had become a metaphor for the full life, full respect, and full autonomy that I had successfully defended against. Someone who had tried to diminish all three, and the eviction notice that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving had ultimately created the space necessary for rebuilding relationships on foundations of mutual respect, rather than enabling dysfunction. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.